The billion-dollar whisper. How one KGB mole made every Soviet submarine visible. Hold it 33 hertz steady. The sonar shack goes silent. A green trace breathes across the screen like a heartbeat. The watch officer leans in, a whisper that isn't a whisper. He's ours. 10,000 tons of Soviet steel, invisible to the eye, now pinned by a song it never meant to sing. The ocean stops being a shield and becomes a stage. This isn't luck. It isn't new hardware. Somewhere far from this pressure hull, someone handed over the language of the deep, acoustic fingerprints that turned ghosts into names. To understand how this ambush was even possible, we go back to Moscow, to one desk. The consequence, the night the ocean spoke. Nuclear deterrents lived in silence. Ballistic missile submarines hid in the dark, promising retaliation nobody wanted to test. If the silence broke, the balance bent. That's the stake on this watch, the difference between a shadow and a target. It starts with a hum, not the obvious churn of screws, not the wash of surfacing waves, a finer thread. The sonar tech nudges the gain down, and the world gets quieter, then sharper. A faint gearbox whine sits under the low pulse, like a violin hidden in a drumline. He learned that contour in a briefing last month, 2 notes apart at a predictable interval. The trainer called it a signature defect, then told them not to ask how the file existed. The US boat isn't chasing a contact trail, it's sorting a voice print. On the plot, there's no hard return yet, nothing to hang a firing solution on. But the classification ladder climbs. Not a merchant, not a fishing trawler, not NATO, Soviet, nuclear, fast attack. Then the slice gets thinner, class, yard, era. The tech glances at a laminated quick reference tucked by the stack, blade rate pattern, auxiliary pump harmonics, turbine power spectra. He doesn't read it, he hears it. Meanwhile, 100 meters away and the thickness of the ocean apart, the Soviet crew feels the change in pressure through routine. The helmsman watches the needle drift a hair more than expected on a turn. The navigator senses that the sea has become less empty. There's no ping, no obvious tail. Just a suspicion shared with no one because what do you say? We're not alone, but I can't prove it. Back on the American sub, the watch officer sticks with the quiet. No active sonar, no sprint, they wait. The library does the chasing. The tone at 33 hertz rides steady, a hint of eccentricity in the shaft telling them propeller blade variances weren't perfectly matched at the factory. That variance shouldn't be in their ears. It should be tucked in a Soviet acceptance test report, stamped red, shelved in a building in Leningrad. This is the moment everything changed, one analyst would say later. But inside the hull, the change felt routine. They slid from maybe to yes, from class to unit. Someone had taken the time to attach hull numbers to songs. The watch officer makes a call up the chain, maintain trail, do not reveal. The goal isn't a kill, it's knowledge. If they can follow this boat from pier to patrol area and back again without a blink, the pattern becomes a calendar. A calendar becomes prediction. Prediction becomes pressure. A micro-story moves with the boat. The sonar tech, 24, remembers failing a module on turbine tones. He went back to the lab at midnight, replayed tapes until the sounds blurred. Then a chief sat beside him and said, "Forget the chart for a second. Listen for the thing that doesn't want to be there." Tonight, that thing clicks into place like a key in a lock. He doesn't cheer. He just lowers his shoulders and keeps listening. Across the ocean, desks light up. A surveillance aircraft farther out lays a sonobuoy line exactly where the new tables say it will matter, not where doctrine used to say. A fixed array hundreds of miles away, one node in SOSUS, reports clarity on a frequency band that used to be mush. Dots connect that never used to meet. But there's a stumble. For 15 minutes the trace goes weird. A passing where the front builds low-frequency noise. The team nearly bumps the contact into a different class, a known decoy signature that would have sent patrol aircraft hunting in the wrong square. Someone calls for a recheck. The chief taps the waterfall display and says, "Wait, the pump harmonics didn't move." Confidence snaps back. Humility gets stapled to the briefing slides for later. The library helps, but the ocean still throws curves. The commander looks at the chart and knows the unspoken part. If they can sort names from noise, they can rank threats, prioritize tails, and shadow the deterrent that keeps the Kremlin sleeping. This boat, with its imperfect shaft and its proud crew, isn't free anymore. It's known. Here's the twist. Everyone on this American sub learned these songs recently. The briefings came like a flood, thicker than usual, more specific than they had any right to be. The trainers didn't say source. They said validated external material. The text didn't ask, but the vibe in the room changed. The ocean wasn't just big, it was labeled. While that was happening in Newfoundland airspace, something else was happening in Moscow conference rooms. Files moved. Signatures were measured. Reports were written with the confidence that only secrecy gives. And at one desk, a man who had read too much, seen too many memos, and swallowed too many small humiliations decided the ocean shouldn't be deaf. He would pass along the index that turned random into reference. They didn't know his name on this night. They just whispered, "He's ours," and stayed in the shadow, following a song they weren't supposed to know existed. What an acoustic signature really is. To understand the ambush, we need to go back to basics, not the diagrams, the ears. An acoustic signature is a fingerprint made of moving parts. Every submarine carries a small orchestra it can't turn off, propeller blades beating time, turbines singing at high RPM, pumps breathing the boat, reduction gears whispering in metal teeth. In theory, two boats of the same class should sound alike. In reality, tolerances drift, craftsmen differ, seas change. The result is character, recognizable, class-wide, sometimes even hull-specific. Start with blade rate. As a propeller turns, each blade slices water and sheds vortices. That shedding arrives at the hydrophone as a rhythmic pulse. Count the beats, you get shaft RPM. Know the blade count, you get speed. But the music isn't clean. Cavitation bubbles pop when a boat pushes too hard, making a crackling hiss that gives away movement. Soviet designers chased that hiss with new blade shapes and bigger screws. They killed some of it. They made other notes louder. Under that sits turbine tone. Steam or gas turbines hum at frequencies tied to their stages. On spectrograms, they're bands, bright, steady, layered like a chord. Swap in a new turbine generation and the chord shifts. Analysts in quiet rooms memorized those shifts like radio DJs knowing tracks by ear. In briefings, they'd say, "Listen for the third harmonic. It creeps at load." They meant, there's a quirk when they accelerate. That quirk is your hook. Then the pumps. Life support, cooling, hydraulics. Each pump pulses. Impeller blades turn through fluid with tiny asymmetries. Bearings wear. A brand new pump may sing a smooth sign. 6 months later, a tiny wobble creates a sideband that flutters at a predictable offset. Stack enough systems, you get a forest of lines. Most drown in ocean noise. A few refuse to disappear. Those few become labels. Signature libraries turn this chaos into identification. Think of them as phone books of sound. At-sea recordings, sonarbys, towed arrays, fixed systems like SOSUS feed raw audio to analysts who strip out weather, shipping, and self-noise. What's left is sorted into classes, Acula, Victor, Delta. Within those, subtypes. Within those, if you're lucky and diligent, units. Over time, a library is not just a static shelf, it's a living dataset. Boats refit, engineers introduce new gearboxes, shipyards tweak tolerances. The phone book needs constant edits, or you start dialing wrong numbers. Sailors learn this like music students. Training isn't just, what is a turbine? It's reps. Old-timers bring tapes from patrols and say, "Hear that, you won't the first time." They play it again at lower gain, then shift it down an octave. It emerges, a faint warble riding the main tone. They give it a name, gear mesh, pump flutter, blade sing, because names help memory. On watch, nobody recites spectra. They listen for that stubborn thing that doesn't belong. Now remember, the Soviets poured billions into quieting. They rafted machinery, mounting heavy equipment on isolation platforms so vibrations don't transmit into the hull. They added anechoic tiles to skin the boats in rubber that absorbs sound. They refined propeller designs in cavitation tunnels to delay bubble collapse. Each fix shaved decibels. Each fix, by changing flow or load, made something else audible to different ears. You win one band, you lose another. Engineers solved problems. Acousticians got new puzzles. Here's where it gets tricky. Building a top-tier library from scratch takes years of global collection. You need geography, fixed arrays in the right choke points. You need luck, boats leaving port in known conditions. You need time. But the briefings on our sub came fast, specific, confident. That suggests something more than good oceanography. It suggests somebody fed the library at the source. Factory records, test basin reports, acceptance trial summaries, where engineers measured exactly what the sea would later hear. The data trail didn't start underwater. It started in file rooms, on drafting tables, in white sea trial reports stamped with codes. The method is mundane. Link a hull to a test to measured frequencies to design choices. Do that across classes and shipyards, and the ocean's static becomes labeled shelves. The sailors called it a miracle. Analysts called it correlation. Somewhere in Moscow, it was just paperwork, until someone decided paperwork could become a weapon. And that decision, the moment paperwork turned into leverage, is the psychological pivot of this story. A single mind choosing method over myth. Moscow, the man in the middle. Understand how a sound crossed an ocean. You have to meet the person who moved paper across hallways. He isn't a legend. He's a mid-level liaison, one foot in the KGB's technical directorates, the other brushing against Navy procurement and research bureaus. His job title is designed to be forgettable: Coordination Officer for Interagency Technical Documentation. He signs routing slips, tracks compliance on audits, and chases late annexes with phone calls nobody remembers making. He sits in a room that smells like paper and toner. Steel grey filing cabinets, waxed linoleum, a window that looks onto another building. The work is routine, and because it's routine, it's invisible. Drafts move from design bureaus to the Navy's main staff. Test reports shuttle back from the White Sea to the yards in Leningrad and Severodvinsk. Procurement memos spiral through committees about bearings, pumps, and gearboxes. He's the person who notices when an annex goes missing because he's the one the colonel calls when a deadline slips. That's how patterns reveal themselves, through boredom. He didn't start as a dissident. He started as a believer with a career plan. Then the system did what it often did. It sanded him down. A promised promotion evaporated with no explanation. A mentor went quiet, then didn't come back from leave. An audit he completed cleanly got marked, insufficiently rigorous, and a superior took the credit after he fixed it. Small frictions, each one explainable, together forming a story he couldn't ignore. At a celebration for a shipyard milestone, he watched managers drink to a schedule they weren't meeting while workers whispered about shortages. When the toasts ended, he walked home in the snow and realized his belief had turned into habit. The habit cracked. Meanwhile, his desk became a crossroads. He handled interagency memos that attached technical annexes most people didn't read. Some were procurement notes about pumps, model changes, bearing suppliers, acceptable vibration thresholds. Others were boring on purpose: schedules for sea trials, standard forms filled with handwritten amendments. Then came a set of documents that didn't look like much until they did. Acceptance test summaries from the White Sea with columns of frequencies and amplitude tolerances. A paragraph noting a persistent sideband near 33 Hz under acceleration at load state B. He stopped. He'd seen that number before, in a separate gearbox memo, flagged as within tolerance but monitored. He didn't yet think treason, he thought method. If these reports existed, and if they lined up with procurement and factory tolerances, then someone who could link hull numbers to test codes could build a picture of how each class sounded. Not theoretically, specifically. It was paperwork, but it described music. The decision didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It took shape in irritations and late nights. He watched how the system punished seriousness and rewarded theater. He read the internal circulars about increased Western submarine activity, the warnings about NATO's provocations. And he remembered the shipyard workers' faces when a batch of bearings arrived with defects and the quota still had to be met. He wondered whether the ocean was a shield or a story the leadership told itself. The choice came down to a simple principle he couldn't say out loud: avoid catastrophe by ending the lie of perfection. If one side believed its boats couldn't be touched, mistakes would follow. He decided to send a method first. If it landed, he'd send substance. He understood the city was built for listening. Phones clicked. Stairwells carried sound. Apartment walls thinned at the worst moments. He started small. He swapped his commute path twice a week without reason. He changed where he bought matches so his routines wouldn't sketch a pattern. He learned to carry nothing he couldn't explain and to explain everything he carried. And he paid attention to how files moved when no one cared. The registry clerk loved a good stamp and hated incomplete signatures. A night shift at the copy room often ran out of toner around 1 in the morning. The janitor had keys that outranked managers. Then came the catalyst. A new directive required additional circulation of naval acoustic testing results to ensure procurement alignment. It widened his paper stream. He now saw cover sheets that listed file codes, trial designations, and recipients. He knew which safe held the originals and which deputy signed the release. He also knew the deputy golfed on Wednesdays. He started making notes that looked like reminders. File code, annex letter, date, yard. On a separate piece of paper, far from work, he rewrote them as a map. He traced how a hull became a test number and how that number tied to a frequency band. He saw it crystallize, the index to a library most sailors didn't know existed. The first whisper wasn't words. It was a decision to move one scrap of metadata out of a building without anyone noticing. A risk, but measured. If it got him caught, it would read like trivia. If it landed, it would tell someone where to look. He stood at his window and watched snow blow across a courtyard. He understood the odds. He also understood the cost of doing nothing. How do you whisper across oceans in a city built on listening? Very slowly, with a method, with the kind of patience only a man numbed by routine can endure. He closed a folder, locked a drawer, and walked into the corridor, another anonymous functionary carrying the names of sounds in his head. First contact, a dangerous hello. First contact kills more spies than greed or glory. He knew that. One wrong look, one extra turn on a staircase, and the city would close around him like a fist. So he didn't start with a meeting. He started with absence, no direct approach, no whispered name. He chose a passive signal, something so ordinary it would blend into Moscow's grey. He rehearsed for weeks, routes at dawn, routes at dusk. He walked alleys, counted lamp posts, timed crosswalk cycles. He learned which storefronts produced reflections he could use as mirrors and which only showed ghostly smears. He switched where he bought bread, and just as important, the brand of matches in his pocket. A small break in habit if someone ever looked too closely. He trimmed his keys down to what he could justify. Everything else lived in his head. The signal would live in a book, not a Russian one, not easily explained at a lecture. He settled on a foreign city guidebook, dog-eared, touristy, unthreatening. Inside the back cover, he would crease one corner twice and write a date that meant nothing to anyone but the person trained to see it. He'd leave it in a hotel lobby with a steady flow of foreigners and the kind of staff that turned over fast. The location had been chosen months earlier by people he'd never meet. He only had to do his part with no flourish. On the day, he walked in with a copy of Pravda under his arm and the guidebook tucked into the fold. He sat, ordered tea he didn't drink, and read an article he'd already memorized. When the teacup clinked down, he slid the guidebook into the magazine rack by the concierge, its spine facing left, another agreed sign. He didn't look back. He paid for the tea, left exact change, and stepped into the street, where exhaust hung low and winter bit his ears. If someone noticed, it wasn't then. The book sat for hours. A woman in a fur hat picked it up, frowned at the language, put it back. A porter moved it a little. Then a man in a tired suit took it, leafed past the back cover too fast, and returned it upside down. That was the point. The signal wasn't the book. It was that someone else knew the book was the signal. 36 hours later, another copy of the same title appeared in a different rack across town, this one with a small dot in the publisher's logo. The door was open. CIA's Moscow rules weren't a slogan, they were survival. No meetings unless unavoidable. No pattern. Assume you are watched, even when you're sure you're not. An SRR kit, short-range radio masked as something trivial, might ride in a diplomat's briefcase, but in Moscow you didn't transmit if you could help it. You used signals, dead drops, brush passes so faint a camera wouldn't catch the exchange, and you stretched time. Everything took longer than feels sane, because speed looks like noise on a surveillance grid built to notice change. Unknown to him, a separate leak had rattled the KGB weeks earlier. Not his world, not his directorate, but it didn't matter. The watchfulness went up a notch. Street teams rotated faster. Militia uniforms thickened at corners that used to be empty on weeknights. Phones clicked more obviously. That made the air feel crowded. It also meant his margin shrank. He didn't try to run a full pitch. He sent proof of life in the smallest way possible. A second signal appeared in a used bookstore he never visited. A copy of a science journal with a pencil line under an article title that corresponded to a rendezvous window. He walked past that store 5 times over 2 days, never going in, always glancing just enough to see if the journal was still there. When it finally vanished, he slept for 3 hours like a man who'd been underwater. Then came the brush pass drill. He stood at a tram stop holding a folded newspaper with the weather page facing out. If a man with a blue scarf and no hat approached, he dropped the paper, stepped back, and the other would pick up what fell. Nothing fell the first 2 tries. The third time, on a morning with wet snow, a scarf appeared. He let the paper slip. A shoe stepped onto the edge, pinning it. Fingers slid underneath. The scarf moved on. He stayed a minute too long, then left, heart in his throat. When contact finally spoke to him, it wasn't a conversation. A handbill appeared on a kiosk he passed once a week, offering lessons in English at odd hours with a phone number matching the code in the guidebook. He wrote it down on a grocery list like it was a recipe. He never dialed. He went to park at the time implied by the last 2 digits. On a bench, under the second slat, he found a small envelope with a single instruction written in block letters. Begin with lists. That night, he walked the long way home. He swapped buses. He paused at a street repair where jackhammers chewed asphalt and trucks idled, drowning the city in a blanket of noise. He slipped the envelope into the lining of his coat under the racket. When he finally reached his apartment, his child asked why he worked nights. "The Navy wants more paper," he said, and felt the lie settle like dust on everything he loved. The next day, he didn't change everything. He moved one thing. He shifted his lunch by 10 minutes. He used a different stairwell. He left work with nothing on him but committed a new rule to memory: slow builds, passive signals, and patience as armor. The door was cracked. What he brought next would have to be undeniable. The first package, proof of life. Verification comes before trust. The instruction was clear: begin with lists, not secrets with headlines, not the crown jewels. Ordinary things that, stitched together, proved he could touch the vault without setting off alarms. He started with procurement notes. He copied cover sheets from a Naval Bureau circular that read like shopping lists, pump models by manufacturer, bearing suppliers with batch numbers, allowable vibration thresholds at rated loads. Dry language, but in the margins, a colonel had initialed a change, substituting a new bearing vendor for the next production lot of a fast attack class. He wrote the code and date. No photos yet. Memory first, then paper. At lunch, he stood in a queue with factory clerks and engineers, listening to jokes that weren't jokes about shortages. He took mental inventory: which plants were late, which shipped early, which got exemptions when they shouldn't. Back at his desk, in pencil on a pad he'd later burn, he drafted a table that looked like any other routing checklist, except its columns lined hull assignments to component swaps by month. He knew better than to carry that out. He waited for the copy room toner to thin after midnight, then made 2 light strikes on an innocuous memo, one that reprinted a standard format for sea trial summaries. The content meant nothing. The header meant everything. It showed who signed, who received, and the code for the annex that always traveled with it. He rolled the paper and slid it under his shirt cuff. He kept his sleeves down until he reached a stairwell drenched in the grind of a floor polisher. There, under the machine's howl, he tucked it into a thin envelope he'd sewn into his coat hem. The first drop was small by design. A public phone booth with a loose advertising panel noted weeks earlier. He arrived early, walked past, saw a cigarette butt he'd placed upright in a crack still standing, and came back an hour later. The panel lifted. The envelope slid in. He closed it with the kind of pressure a man uses to keep a secret from breaking. Then he left and rode 2 stops past his apartment before circling back on foot. On the other end, the CIA treated scraps like gold. In a safe room a continent away, an analyst read the procurement codes out loud while another pulled satellite tasking folders. If a bearing vendor changed, could overhead imagery of rail yards near that plant show an uptick in shipments? If a pump model shifted, could a sonobuoy line near a naval base catch a new sideband offset predicted by the specs? They weren't guessing. They were triangulating. SIGINT teams combed for increased chatter around acceptance trials. A logistics officer flagged a rail consist that matched a part run heading north. The pieces clicked. The response came back the way it had to, almost invisible. A single pencil in a dead mailbox, nothing else. Not a message, a gesture. It said, "We have it, keep going." He found it before work, a grey morning trembling with the rattle of tramlines. He took the pencil like a man accepts a diagnosis, without changing his face. An office reshuffle tried to break his reach. Desks moved 2 rooms over, safes rolled on dollies, access logs reassigned to a chief who liked to count signatures. The test annexes he paged through now lived behind a second door with a clipboard that never left its nail. He adapted. Daytime swaps, nighttime copies. He volunteered to help clean the audit trail after the move. That gave him fingers on the ledger. He timed the sign-outs so his looks matched other people's needs. Buried inside the innocuous stack he'd assembled was what the Americans didn't know to ask for until they saw it, an index. Not a master list, a breadcrumb map. File codes for trial programs in the White Sea and Barents, cross-referenced with hull numbers, shipyard series, and variant identifiers, presented as distribution rosters. He didn't take the files. He took the keys to the hallway where the files lived. He photographed 3 pages in a bathroom with a window that opened onto an alley. The camera was no bigger than a cigarette pack. He developed nothing. He dropped the film in a paint can wired under a bridge rail at dawn, then walked away before the city fully woke. At Langley and Suitland and Norfolk, the index changed tempo. The library managers stopped wandering in the dark and started asking for volumes by name. They sent targeted tasking to SOSUS nodes aligned with Arctic exits where those hulls ran trials. Sonobuoy teams tuned to frequency bands hinted by the annex codes. NAVSEA analysts who treated harmonics like familial traits built tables that said, if a Victor III from Severodvinsk with this pump shows up, expect these sidebands. When the recordings arrived, the matches weren't perfect. They were close enough to make the hair rise on the back of an analyst's neck. Tradecraft stayed dull on purpose. He didn't meet a handler. He found a matchbox with a notch in the 3rd strike pad that meant repeat location next week. Later, a hollow rock swapped into a construction lot near a tram depot, noise cover guaranteed by jackhammers at noon. He held his breath only when silence fell. Then the complication, an internal audit mandate triggered by a glitch elsewhere, crawled toward his corridor. Specialists began spot-checking file request patterns. A colleague returned from a meeting and never sat down again. His chair stayed empty, coat still on the hook. He felt heat hit the back of his neck. He cut volume, slowed cadence, and stripped his packages back to metadata, nothing that sang on its own. But the index had landed. Proof of life wasn't the pencil. It was the correlation spike on a spectrogram thousands of miles away. A faint tone at 33 Hz, logged at sea, now matched a line in a Soviet acceptance test summary nobody outside those ministries was supposed to read. The Americans didn't cheer. They updated a table and ordered more patience. He went home that night and washed his hands twice. He sat at the kitchen table while his child drew a boat with a big propeller. He didn't smile. He asked about homework. He looked at the clock. He felt the city listening through the walls and decided the next package would look as boring as humanly possible. The library of the deep, the index. An index doesn't look like power. It looks like a table of contents, dry codes, dates, recipients. But if the codes point to where sound becomes paper, it's a map to the vault. He understood that the moment a distribution sheet tied White Sea trials to specific hulls and to annex letters, internal attachments that held frequency analyses and transient behavior he'd never seen released outside a narrow ring. The stakes felt simple and lethal. If he could move an index of Soviet acoustic trials, he wasn't handing over guesses. He was pointing to baseline recordings of how classes truly sounded when engineers measured them clean before salt and age blurred the edges. That's not just identification. That's the foundation of a library that can name boats in the dark. He started by cataloging the seams. File numbers told stories if you listened. A series beginning with OS-12 tracked basin tests at Severodvinsk. WB-7 attached to White Sea acceptance runs under load with instrumentation mounted at fixed points in the hull. Annex G often contained frequency domain analyses. Annex J captured transient behavior, what happened when a turbine spooled or a pump cycled. He built a legend in his head, then reduced it to 4 pencil strokes that meant everything to him and nothing to anyone else. The action had to look ordinary. He couldn't check out a binder thick with stamped pages. He could, however, become the person who helped reconcile distribution lists. When a visiting auditor from a Navy office needed copies, he volunteered to shepherd the paperwork. That put him in rooms he'd only passed before. He kept his eyes on headers, not content. He skimmed abstracts for keywords: harmonics, sidebands, blade rate, cavitation onset. He copied metadata, not measurements, and photographed title pages that listed annex letters and print counts. A janitor's cart became cover. A stuck cabinet became a clock he worked against, palms damp while a latch refused to give. Bureaucratic sloppiness gave him breadcrumbs. A typist reused an older cover sheet with a previous distribution block still faintly visible beneath a fresh imprint. A clerk misstamped a date that told him which batch went to which yard. A handwritten note in a margin: Delta IV retrofitted pumps per Directive 178, linked a class to a component change. Each imperfection widened the picture. Back across the ocean, the impact came fast. The index landed in a windowless room where analysts pinned code series strips on a corkboard like a detective chart. White Sea trial codes clustered by month. Hull numbers aligned under shipyard runs. The Americans realized there wasn't just a stack of reports. There was a program, systematic, repeatable, with baselines that could be tracked over time. That meant they could do more than listen. They could anticipate. Targets shifted. SOSUS tasking focused on exit lanes during known trial periods. Patrol aircraft laid sonar lines tuned to bands flagged by Annex G references. A towed array team, briefed on expected transient behavior from Annex J, rode a throttle change into a clean capture of a turbine's third harmonic creep. When the spectrogram lit, someone clapped once and then apologized to the quiet. He still had to feed the map. Classification ring fences tightened around him. A new rule required co-signatures to access the very lists he needed. He wasn't going to get them, so he changed roles. He social engineered a special project as a visiting auditor for a week, borrowing authority from a colonel who liked problems to disappear. He wore a badge with a temporary stamp and a serious face, and he didn't overreach. He asked for abstracts, not annexes. He requested print-run verification, a phrase dull enough to pass. He never touched the core data. He touched everything around it. In the hallways, he kept the beats small. A stop to ask about a stapler. A question about whether a form required blue ink or black. He knew that confidence draws heat. Competence, unremarkable and steady, slides by. In a bathroom with a high window and a broken latch, he photographed 2 more distribution pages, rolling the microfilm with a thumbnail nick he used as a frame counter. He wrapped the canister in wax paper and tucked it into a hollow under a stair tread he'd tested with a coin. Impact rippled outward. Now, when a new class left port, analysts could cross-check not just the likely frequency bands, but the likely manufacturing tolerances that created telltale offsets. A Victor built after a certain date, from a yard that swapped to a specific pump vendor, would show sidebands at a known separation. A delta refit cycle would flatten a harmonic the old tables misread. Calls went out to relabel old tapes, to correct mis-ID that had bugged people for years. The map sharpened. There was a cost. KGB counter-surveillance teams noted an oddity. File requests for distribution rosters spiked in a department that rarely needed them. An internal memo, stamped Control, ordered inventory spot checks. A quiet man from another directorate stood at the end of a corridor for an hour, pretending to read a bulletin board. A colleague vanished. He felt the floor tilt. He cut his exposure again. He stopped copying header pages and shifted to scribbling only code fragments into a pocket calendar already filled with family birthdays and grocery lists. He built mnemonics, children's rhymes that hid annex letters in nonsense. He stopped visiting the same stairwell twice in a week. He moved his dead drop from a bridge rail to a tram yard perimeter where drills masked all sound and men in reflective vests made everyone invisible. Then he made a choice that pushed the story forward. With the map in hand, the Americans could ask for specific volumes, specific annexes at specific times. He would now aim to lift content, not just keys. He didn't know if he'd get another window. He knew what mattered next: core annexes, propeller vibrational analyses, pump jet harmonic tables, acceptance test deviations by hull. If he pulled those out, the ocean would never be as dark again. The lift, extracting the signatures. He knew what mattered now: annexes that turned hints into hard numbers. Annex G for frequency domain analyses. Annex J for transients. Propeller vibrational charts tying blade defects to sidebands. Pump jet harmonic tables that told a towed array where to listen when a boat breathed. Those weren't maps to a vault anymore. They were the vault. The file room lived 2 floors down, behind a door with a ledger and a clerk who believed in ink. He couldn't beat the ledger. He could beat time. He studied the rhythm: when the clerk took a smoke break, when the night janitor rolled a cart past the door, when the corridor emptied for a meeting everyone pretended mattered. He built a schedule around gaps. Then he built a switch. He signed out a binder he had a reason to touch: distribution verification for a routine circular. He slid it along the counter like a man moving a boring problem. In his pocket, a second binder cover, same color, same wear, a stamp he'd imitated with a rubber eraser carved into a crude seal. The content inside would change later. The outside fooled eyes, not scrutiny. Scrutiny would never come if the ledger matched. The microfilm camera rode in a pen. It clicked quietly if you pressed the clip just right. Not clever, just enough. He tested it at home by photographing the pattern on his kitchen tablecloth. If the squares aligned in the negatives, his hands were steady. If they drifted, he practiced until the shake left his fingers. He waited for the janitor's cart. The key wasn't the keyring, it was the sound. The cart's wheels squealed on one tile seam outside the file room, a noise he'd measured in steps from the stairwell. He counted under his breath, stepped into the corridor as the squeal hit, and asked the janitor about a spill 2 floors up. The man shrugged, grinned the grin of someone who sees everyone and remembers no one, and reached for a rag. While the door hung open, he slid the binder in, signed, and breathed. Inside, the cabinet stuck. It always stuck. He timed hands to this latch in his sleep, and still, with his palms damp, it refused to lift. He didn't yank. He pushed down, then up, the way an old mechanic showed him once on a bus seat. It gave. He counted to 6 to slow his pulse, then pulled Annex G from a Victor Series trial. He didn't read. He photographed headers, tables, legends, any page that tied frequencies to conditions and hull identifiers. He rolled film with a thumbnail nick he used as a frame counter, because losing count invites panic. A cart rolled past and didn't stop. He didn't look. He moved to pump jet harmonic tables for a Delta class, annex letters buried behind 4 other documents. He photographed 20 pages, then slid everything back with edges aligned to the degree. Sloppiness is a signal. He left neat. The switch lived in the ledger. He timed his exit so the clerk's smoke break ended as he closed the binder. He signed a time that matched his entrance minus the exact average duration of 3 previous visits, all written in the same hand. He didn't look proud. He looked bored. Dead drops rotated. The bridge rail was burned. The tram yard stayed noisy but got new eyes. He shifted to a market crush near a train station where vendors shouted and the floor stayed wet. In a stall that sold nails by the handful, a coffee tin sat under a shelf with a false bottom. He tapped twice, lifted, and pressed the film canister into the gap. He bought nails he didn't need. He weighed the bag like a man comparing prices. Across the ocean, the impact was immediate and unnerving. NSA and NAVSEA teams pulled the microfilm out of the pouch and held annex pages against spectrograms from at-sea captures. The match wasn't anecdotal. It was indexed. A faint sideband at 33 Hz under a load change appeared in both. A pump jet table predicted a flutter at a given offset. The recording showed the same flutter, drifting with temperature like the annex note warned. Correlation leapt from maybe to yes. In quiet rooms, briefers rewrote training slides with specifics they'd never dared include, and no one said the source out loud. Then the pushback. KGB internal auditors noticed a pattern in file requests, small but real. A department that rarely touched annex rosters now touched them. A memo triggered spot checks. A colonel's deputy asked for ledgers without warning. He walked into work and felt the air change. Conversations clipped, phones clicked harder. A colleague's desk sat untouched. The coat stayed on the hook. No one said the word. Everyone heard it. He throttled back. Fewer, bigger packages. He cut all handwritten notes, shifted to photographic memory, and rehearsed pages at his desk in glances that looked like skimming. He routed his next lift through a diplomatic pouch relay. The handoff meant moving past a fixed camera outside an embassy he wasn't supposed to approach. He waited for parade practice to drown the street in drumlins and militia boots. Under that sanctioned chaos, he compressed months of work into a single canister. Human moments intruded. His child brought home a note about a school performance. He nodded, promised to be there, then stared at the date and calculated whether an internal audit cycle would crest that week. He lied twice in one sentence and hated the taste of it. He slept in bursts, heart pacing ahead of dawn. He woke at the same time every night, listening for vehicles in the courtyard. He felt a tail once, not obvious, too competent. A man who appeared in a reflection where he shouldn't have, then vanished. He ran a preplanned SDR through metro loops and station mirrors, checked for persistence, and found his shadow gone by the third turn. He didn't congratulate himself. He skipped 2 drops and burned a canister in his sink, blue flames licking metal as chemicals hissed. The last lift of this run hurt his hands. The cabinet stuck worse. The latch bit his skin. He pulled Annex J for a new fast attack class and photographed the transient behavior tables until his fingers cramped. When he slid the binder back, a sheet caught and creased. He smoothed it with a fingernail and felt the tremor he couldn't afford. He left the room without leaving a scent of haste. The Americans now heard what shouldn't be heard. A library of defects, tolerances, and rhythms sat in their safes, aligned with a sea that suddenly made sense. In Moscow, men with blank expressions began asking quiet questions at desks like his. He adjusted his routes and waited for the next signal, knowing the smell of a traitor carries far before anyone says a name. The hunt at sea, from ghosts to names. Orders rippled out like a quiet shockwave. Boats already on station got retasked mid-patrol. P3 crews woke to briefings with new tables circled in red pencil. Tune here, ignore that, expect a transient at throttle up. The message was blunt: stop chasing noise, start naming it. A watch officer on a Lowe's Angels class boat stared at a waterfall display that looked like rain. He had a decision to make. If the annex tables were right, a quiet tone hugging 33 Hz would be the thread. He staked his reputation on it. Hold depth, back 1/3, let him run, he said, betting a career on a hum most people couldn't hear. Meanwhile, SOSUS stations lit up with a different kind of confidence. Operators who'd spent years flagging maybe now, maybe later, suddenly had a key. Patterns that used to smudge into the floor pulled apart. A node off Iceland tagged a Victor III leaving Murmansk. Another down the line in the GRUK gap confirmed it by the pump sideband that refused to wander. The map didn't just fill in, it cohered. At sea, the first confirmation came faster than anyone expected. A Soviet sub cleared the breakwater, did its standard checks, and eased into the lane. The US boat held outside visual range, nose down, ears up. The tone appeared on cue. Then the transient creep at power increase hit exactly where Annex J said it would. Third harmonics, slight upward drift, a wobble at the edge like a singer taking a breath. The classification ladder jumped. Not class, not yard, unit. They had him by name minutes after he left port. On a P3, a sensor operator tossed a sonobuoy chain like he'd done 100 times, except now the placement was surgical. The table said the turbine's second harmonic would ride cleanest in a notch just off the shelf. He tuned, waited, heard the warble and felt his scalp prickle. "Got him," he said into a headset no one dared celebrate into. They tracked at standoff range, never crowding, always listening. Unknown to them, across town in Moscow, phones burned. Fleet staffers demanded to know why NATO aircraft seemed to be in the right squares at the wrong times. Line officers blamed leaks that weren't there. Engineers pointed at tolerances and whispered about defects. Nobody had the full picture yet. Everyone felt the pressure. Back in the Atlantic, the Hunt learned humility the hard way. An early run mis-ID'd a target. What looked like a Delta's blade rate pattern turned out to be a noisy merchant tug with a weird gearbox resonance. A P3 crew wasted 2 hours laying lines in a dead quadrant. The debrief was merciless. "Trust the pump harmonics, not the headline," a chief said, rapping his knuckles on a console. The lessons stuck. The library was a compass, not a steering wheel. Then came the moment that made believers out of skeptics. A watch officer on a boat shadowing the Barents exit had been told to expect a new fast attack class trialing with instrumentation aboard. The annex notes warned that under certain loads, the turbine's third harmonic would creep, a slow slide like a glass on a wet table. He heard the slide, called it, and held fire on a maneuver that would have forced the Soviet to show himself. Minutes later, the creep stabilized exactly as predicted. The US boat tucked in behind the trail and rode it out to deep water, an invisible hand on a shadow's shoulder. Parallel action kept pressure on the map. SOSUS nodes cross-checked with towed arrays, confirming not just presence but direction and tempo. An analyst in Norfolk built a board that looked like a rail timetable, departures, speeds, expected turns, refuel points. It wasn't prophecy, it was pattern. With names came routes, with routes came windows. Windows meant choices. A micro story landed on a deck plate. A junior sonar tech, the same one who'd once failed turbine tones, leaned over his scope at 20 and picked out a flutter he'd trained his ears to ignore. He flagged it. The watch officer trusted him. What followed was a clean tail that held for 36 hours without a single active ping. Back in port, the tech didn't get a medal. He got a handshake and an extra watch bill. He didn't mind. The ripple effects moved into operations planning. Carrier groups adjusted their shields based on which Soviet boats were out and where. ASW helicopters drilled to specific tables, tuning gear to bands they'd ignored before. The best part, from the American perspective, was invisibility. The Soviets didn't know why the ocean felt thinner. They just knew it did. Early overconfidence took a hit during a storm when sea-state noise filled the low bands. The 33 Hz thread washed out. A crew almost forced contact, looking for a signal that was buried under weather. The senior chief made them wait. Then he chased the pump sidebands, which don't drown the same way. The contact reappeared at a slight offset. Another lesson stapled into deckplate lore. When the ocean shouts, listen for what refuses to shout back. By late season, the library wasn't a stack of papers anymore. It was muscle memory. Crews talked in shorthand. Annex G says watch the second harmonic at load B became a finger tap on a knob and a nod. Confidence spread without swagger, a quiet kind. And while that was happening in dark rooms and cold seas, the consequence took shape ashore. Soviet deployments grew predictable enough to brief like weather. Commanders saw it on slides and felt it in their stomachs. The ocean had been a veil. Now it was a window. Moscow panic, mole hunt and meltdown. The first clue wasn't a file gone missing. It was a chart. A Northern Fleet briefing showed NATO aircraft showing up at the right places too often to be coincidence. A vice admiral tapped the map with a pen until the ink bled and asked the only question that mattered: who is talking? Orders rolled downhill. The KGB opened a special investigation unit with a bland name and a hard mandate: identify leak pathways inside naval research and procurement chains. Polygraph chairs warmed. Surprise bag checks appeared at building entrances where no one had ever been stopped. Telephone audits pulled call logs for every extension touching White Sea trial paperwork. A fresh stack of loyalty oaths hit desks with a deadline that felt like a dare. He felt it before he saw it. The corridor's noise dropped by half. People stopped telling jokes. A colleague from 2 doors down didn't show for tea. Later, his desk sat untouched, a brown mug ring on paper that wouldn't be thrown away. No one asked where he went. Everyone knew not to. Workflow froze. A memo that took a day now took a week as secretariats began overstamping everything, control copy, and moving pieces by hand. That made the search harder. It also exposed gaps. Files that used to traverse 4 offices now revealed a 5th clerk who'd always been in the loop without anyone noticing. The special unit mapped circulation like arteries. They didn't need content. They needed deviations. One deviation came from a typist's error, a misnumbered distribution list that accidentally sent an abstract to the wrong room. The abstract came back immediately, but a note landed in a case file. Why did room 314 receive Annex G headers? That note bred a visit. 2 men in quiet suits showed up with polite smiles and blank palms. They asked about process, not people. He kept his eyes on the carpet and described forms, ledgers, and the sanctity of signatures with the enthusiasm of a clerk who only cares about ink. The false lead that followed was both relief and horror. An engineer with a gambling debt fit a pattern they liked. He'd requested trial rosters twice in a month. He'd taken long lunches. He'd frowned at a loyalty oath. They pulled him in. After 3 days, he was gone. Word on the stairwell said foreign contacts, whispered with the frequency of fear. The truth didn't matter. The message did. The net is up, and it's catching. He adjusted again. He cut his touches to the thinnest possible thread. No annex codes, only routing blocks, only when another person's signature created cover. He stopped volunteering for reconciliation and started losing minor forms that would force others to retrace steps he could observe. Watching became his commodity. Then a new policy hit. Cosins for any document citing White Sea trials, retroactive inventory verification, and random desk sweeps. He came in one morning to find his bottom drawer open and a handkerchief folded wrong. A courtesy, a warning. Phones got theatrical. Clicks announced themselves like coughs. A friend from another bureau took a call, said, "Yes, of course," hung up, and cleared his throat before leaving for a meeting he wouldn't return from. The building adopted a new rhythm, long silences punctuated by flurries of keys and whispers. The special unit liked to arrive at 16:55. He began leaving at 16:40 and arriving at 07:10, hoping to slide past attention like a worker bee. Moscow rules on his end hardened. No more tramyard dead drops. Construction sites now came with watchers on ladders. He shifted to signal sites under sanctioned noise. A street resurfacing crew, a state parade rehearsal, a boiler purge at a factory where steam howled like a gale. He wrapped a microfilm can in electrician's tape and pressed it into the tar seen between 2 cobbles while trucks idled inches away. He didn't look down. He looked bored. His child asked why he worked nights. "Budget," he said, tearing bread into small pieces he didn't eat. The weight of the lie settled in his chest. He began keeping a packed bag in the back of a wardrobe, not for escape, just for the ritual of control. A sweater, a toothbrush, a photo tucked into a book he'd never carry. Across the river, naval leadership panicked in a disciplined way. Orders went out to recheck propellers, to swap pump vendors, to raft machinery more aggressively. An internal circular demanded immediate mitigation of acoustic vulnerabilities, with a list of directives that read like prayers. Engineers wrote back with physics. Tolerances cost money, time, and pride. Managers promised both without knowing where to find either. An analytical error almost cooked him. A special unit analyst, staring too long at access logs and convinced patterns exist everywhere, drew a line from Annex G requests to his corridor. The logic was neat. It was wrong. The error bought him a day of heat. He felt eyes at his back and a pause when he signed for a ledger. He changed nothing. He didn't run. By morning, the line had been redrawn toward a shipyard office 2 districts away. Someone else would feel the pause. Fear broke small things. A secretary cried quietly at her desk after a bagged check spilled lipstick and letters onto a floor. A lieutenant raised his voice about staples like they were sabotage. A battalion of janitors suddenly mattered because their keys did. The building didn't hum, it ticked. He considered stopping. He tried for a week. He moved only inside his head. He slept in chunks and woke to the same thought. If the ocean was a little safer now because knowledge replaced myth, then stopping wasn't a neutral act. It was a choice to hand silence back to men who used it as armor. He chose, again, to continue. Fewer touches, bigger pauses, harsher self-checks. He burned notes he'd kept for too long and practiced names and numbers in a whisper, until they felt like a song he could sing without thinking. The special unit widened the search, and paranoia became policy. But the meltdown brought a strange clarity with it. The system that had hidden defects now exposed them in a rush to fix blame. Every patch order, every vendor swap, every temporary variance became another breadcrumb he could memorize. The hunt made him smaller. It also, accidentally, made his map larger. Tradecraft under fire. Pressure closed in like cold metal. The special unit's net tightened, and the old Moscow rules stopped being advice and became oxygen. He treated every block as a stage, every reflection as a confession. No patterns, no warmth, no improvisation. He shifted his signals under sanctioned chaos, places where noise made everyone deaf. A trolley line replacement on Sadovaya gave him a week of cover. Jackhammers bit into stone, compressors coughed, foremen yelled. He walked the perimeter with a rolled blueprint he didn't need. When the air compressor peaked, he leaned to tie a shoe and pressed a microfilm can, wrapped in black tape, into a tar seam between cobbles. He stood, brushed grit from his knee, and kept walking. No head turns. No second looks. He changed his map to avoid being mapped. He rotated footwear and gait, stiffer shoulders on Mondays, a slight hitch on Thursdays, an umbrella carried even when skies held. He stopped reading the same newspaper in public. He added a cheap ring to his right hand for 3 weeks, then lost it on purpose. He took elevators he used to avoid and climbed stairs he used to love. He let himself become forgettable by refusing to be consistent. At home, the cost tallied in small questions. His child asked why he worked nights again. Budget cycle, he said, rinsing a plate twice though it was clean. He started leaving notes for himself in code, folded into family life. Grocery lists that hid file codes in the first letters, a chore chart whose boxes reminded him of annex letters. He burned them before they could become a habit, then rebuilt them in his head. He slept light and woke certain he'd heard a footfall in the corridor that wasn't there. His handler adjusted too, distance stretched, payloads grew. No more trickle of envelopes through street furniture. Fewer, heavier packages moved through diplomatic pouch relays that meant one exposed moment near an address he should never approach. They picked national holidays, when militia and cameras turned toward parades and the city accepted disorder. He walked against the flow near the embassy wall, tucked behind a lamppost with peeling paint, and slid a flat package beneath a loose stone edge scuffed by 1,000 boots. Drums rolled, boots stamped, a whistle blew, every sound designed to swallow a click, a sigh, a heartbeat. Risk compresses as cadence slows. Each transfer now carried months of work, annex excerpts, distribution fragments, procurement variances collated like a mosaic. He rehearsed the route until it felt dull. He never ran the route twice. He kept one rule sacred. If anything felt wrong, abort and eat the loss. He aborted twice in a month. The third attempt went clean. Then came the bleed over, the compromise in another directorate that threatened to tangle strings he didn't know he shared. A Western asset under questioning had touched a name that touched a corridor that touched his ledger. The special unit's questions widened by a degree no one could see, and suddenly, an ordinary inventory check felt like a hand measuring a neck. He answered with boredom. He produced a misfiled staple like it was a confession and let a captain take credit for finding it. He swallowed his pride and bought himself an hour. He built a sanctuary in noise. A boiler purge at a factory across the river vented steam that screamed against brick. He used it as a meeting he'd never admit happened. He arrived early, walked past twice, and only on the third pass did he slide his hand beneath a rusted pipe bracket and retrieve a foil-wrapped note thin as a leaf. He didn't read it until he reached a market stall where fishmongers hammered ice and radios fought for space in the air. Human moments kept leaking through the armor. He missed the first act of his child's school performance because a tail, subtle, persistent, appeared in the convex mirror of a kiosk he'd never noticed before. He ran a preplanned SDR across 3 metro lines, using polished tiles as mirrors and the curve of a platform as a shield. He let 2 trains go and boarded the 3rd just as the doors cut a glove from a reaching hand. He rode past his stop and didn't unclench his jaw for 4 stations. That night, he packed a small bag again, not to run, but to remind himself he could. He wrote a goodbye he'd never send and burned it in the sink with matches he didn't buy on his usual corner. He watched the paper curl and thought of the men in his corridor who'd learned to speak softly so microphones wouldn't strain. He kept going because stopping now would mean the silence returned to men who mistook it for strength. He focused on one next thing: fewer touches, bigger payloads, thicker noise. He would change how he stole, or he wouldn't survive to steal again. The price: blood in the water. The reckoning didn't arrive with sirens. It came as absences, desks emptied, phones rang once and stopped. A senior designer at a shipyard retired between breakfast and lunch. An admiral's portrait came off a corridor wall before anyone could sign the guest book at his farewell. On paper, nothing happened. In the rooms that mattered, the message was blunt: pay for the leaks, then patch the holes. Arrests began quietly, then not. A procurement officer who pushed through a bearing vendor change vanished after a midnight knock. An engineer who'd requested annex rosters twice in a month was led past his colleagues without looking up. There were no charges on bulletin boards. There were whispers in stairwells, closed courts, state crimes, sentences that erased faces. Outside a courthouse with frosted glass, a widow clutched a scarf and waited for a name that wouldn't be spoken. She didn't cry. She stared at the door until the cold chased her home. Inside the Navy, countermeasures hit the water fast. New screws went on the list: larger diameter, refined edges, tighter tolerances in the hopes of pushing cavitation onset deeper. Machinery got rafted harder. Isolation mounts thickened, pump housings rebalanced, piping reclamped. Crews altered operational patterns overnight. No more lazy throttle sweeps near the exit lanes. No more predictable acceleration tests at the same waypoint. Captains who'd trained one way for a decade rewired habits in a week. The gains were partial and expensive. Some signatures faded as intended. The old 33 Hz sideband thinned on refitted hulls, but other notes refused to die. Pump harmonics drifted, not disappeared, shifting enough to confuse the first pass and then settling where the library expected under load. A new propeller killed a familiar blade sing and introduced a faint gear mesh from the fresh reduction set. Engineers cheered a decibel chart. Acousticians rolled their eyes and scribbled new labels. The sea kept telling the truth. Western navies adjusted in stride. Libraries updated like weather reports. Tactics flexed. Patrol aircraft carried revised cue sheets that leaned into transients when steady-state tone vanished. Towed arrays tweaked filter banks to catch the new gear mesh that replaced a retired defect. A carrier group altered its screen based on a refit cycle briefed that morning. Pressure stayed on without revealing source. The trick wasn't one perfect table. It was speed. Measure, adapt, measure again. Back in Moscow, fear turned prescriptive. Directives stacked. Weld audits at prop shops, metrology sweeps at pump plants, unannounced inspections at gear cutters. Managers promised miracles under timelines that mocked physics. The special unit broadened its net and found what big systems always find under stress: everything. Real leaks, false trails, petty theft, pride. A young officer signed 3 loyalty oaths in a month and still jumped when his phone clicked. A colonel started smoking again after 20 years and finished a pack before the elevator reached the ground floor. He felt the collateral damage like a bruise. A colleague's wife stopped nodding hello. A janitor who'd always grinned now avoided his eyes. He tightened his whirl to the walk from desk to door and the breath he took passing a boiler vent that roared loud enough to hide thoughts. He cut his cadence to almost nothing. He refused to be the flutter in a quiet room. Across the ocean, the human element stayed sharp. A sonar chief updated a training deck with a note in the margin. Don't marry a frequency, marry a behavior. He told rookies the old songs were still useful, but verses had changed, keys had shifted. In a simulator, he killed the 33 Hz tone and made them find the pump flutter that lived where pride said nothing should live. They groaned, learned, and wrote it down like a recipe they'd one day cook on a bad night. Meaning settled in, heavier than any arrest. Deterrents bent, not broken, bent. A fleet that believed its trump card hid in perfect quiet now knew it carried a name tag that could be read by someone patient enough to listen. That changes decisions in rooms with maps and clocks. Schedules moved. Patrol zones shifted. Confidence thinned into caution, which sounds like safety until you realize caution under fear breeds mistakes. He knew there was one package left that could close the circle. Not more annexes. The connective tissue, factory tolerances, build variances, acceptance test deviations by hull. The mosaic that turned classes into individuals and made prediction a craft, not luck. He built it in his head first, assembling shards from memos, rosters, and plant notes that had slipped past a dozen clerks, tired eyes. He walked slower, breathed shallower, and waited for a window that wouldn't open twice. Blood was already in the water. He could smell the iron in it every time a chair sat empty and a door stayed closed. He also knew the ocean didn't stop singing because men shouted on shore. The price had been paid. The bill wasn't finished. The last package. He'd been building it in his head for months. The mosaic that would turn classes into individuals. Not a table of harmonics. The connective tissue. Factory tolerances that drifted in winter. Build variances in late shifts. Acceptance test deviations scribbled in margins when a pump whined, but within limits, kept a schedule on track. Names, dates, defects. The stuff that makes one hull speak slightly off-key from its sister. The stakes were brutal and clean. If he moved this, the library wouldn't just sort by family, it would call roll by hull. That's precision you feel in your bones at sea. That's also a death sentence if caught. He weighed it anyway. The system had already drawn blood. The only question left was whether the risk brought clarity or just drama. He chose clarity. He started at the edges, plants and bureaus that never talked to each other but shared a calendar. A pump vendor in Kazan logged winter runs with a looser tolerance when a shipment of bearings arrived with hairline flaws. A gear cutter in Kharkiv tracked a regrind batch that shaved a micrometer deeper than spec for 6 weeks straight. A prop shop in Leningrad documented a blade milling jig recalibration that slipped by one tick before a foreman fixed it with a cigarette in his mouth and a stopwatch in his hand. None of it screamed. Together it sang. He copied nothing at first. He walked slower, read faster, and converted data into mnemonics that would survive a bag check. Hull numbers became street names from his childhood. Tolerance bands turned into the number of steps between his apartment and the tram stop. Acceptance test deviations mapped onto his child's multiplication tables. He rehearsed until the mosaic lived behind his eyes. Then he assembled paper, quietly, plausibly. He wrote a memo to himself that looked like a reconciliation request and layered it with attachments that were innocuous on their own. A plant notice here, a shift log there, a procurement variance next to an acceptance signature block. He never stacked more than 3. He never walked with the stack. He fed each leaf through a different door at a different time and photographed them over a week like a man patient enough to watch grass grow. The handoff had to ride a crowd, and Moscow's calendar offered a shield, a parade day. Militia on corners. Street grids tightened. Cameras pointed at flags and faces, not lamppost seams. The plan hinged on noise and motion. He'd use a diversion near the embassy wall when a marching band drowned the sidewalks, slide the thin package into a stone void he'd tested with a pencil, and keep moving with the wave. He prepared like a coward and a professional. He bought a new coat one size too large so the fold under the lining wouldn't print. He trimmed every pocket down to one key, one coin, one handkerchief. He swapped his glasses frame to change how cameras read his face. He wore a pin that signaled nothing except belongs here in a city that liked symbols. The day dawned cold and bright. Drums set the pace. Boots hammered rhythm into asphalt. He entered the flow 2 blocks early, matched cadence, and kept his eyes on the shoulders ahead of him. When the band hit the corner, brass blasting, he veered into a pocket of sound where even his breath felt muffled. A child on a father's shoulders waved a small flag that snapped like a metronome. He used the snap to time his step. At the wall, a scuffed stone offered the notch he needed. He slowed half a beat as if adjusting his scarf, slid 2 fingers under the lip, and let the package ride the seam. It caught, then seated. He didn't look back. He took 3 steps, then 5, and folded into the current like a leaf. Complication arrived as a lens. A camera on a roofline panned past the crowd and hesitated. Not long enough to feel heat on his neck. He tasted metal. He didn't break stride. He shifted his gait to mirror the man in front of him, left shoulder forward, right heel heavy, and bled his profile into the mass. He turned at the next corner where a militia officer barked at no one in particular. He let the bark push him. Across the ocean, a pouch clerk opened a diplomatic bag hours later and found the flat packet tucked like a letter under a stack of newsletters. Inside were fragments that, stitched together, made a ledger of imperfection. Factory tolerances by batch and season. Build variances by shift. Acceptance test deviations tied to hulls by name and date. NAVSEA's room fell quiet in a way that meant the work was landing. Analysts overlaid plant notes on spectrograms and watched stubborn quirks line up like constellations. Unit by unit, the smear turned into dots you could count. Back in Moscow, the surveillance grid tightened for the holiday, the worst and best time to move. Extra militia meant more eyes. It also meant nobody had enough focus. He rode that thin line, walked home on side streets, and took the long stairwell up. He stood in his kitchen and listened. No vehicles, no boots. A kettle hissed, sounding like steam purging a boiler across a river. He poured, then dumped the cup in the sink. His hands shook hard enough to rattle porcelain. He wrote a goodbye he'd never send, 3 sentences that said everything without a name. He held the paper over the sink, struck a match from a different kiosk, and watched the flame eat the edges. Smoke rose and threaded the light like a thin wire on a spectrogram. He opened the window, let winter bite his face, and left the ash in the drain. Impact traveled ahead of consequence. With the Mosaic, the library didn't just predict class behavior, it forecast individual habits. How a specific hull's pump flutter drifted with temperature, how a gear mesh sang after a refit, how a throttle change would smear a 3rd harmonic at load state B for this boat, and not its sister. At sea, that meant confidence without arrogance. Ashore, it meant shipyards would feel unseen hands in their tooling for years. Somewhere, a camera caught a shadow out of place near a wall. Somewhere, an analyst circled a frame and wrote a note. He went to bed knowing someone was coming. He slept anyway, not because he felt safe, but because the sea finally sounded honest in the rooms where it needed to. Capture or escape, the razor's edge. He felt it as pressure, not footsteps. The air in the stairwell thickened. A door on the landing below opened and didn't close. He walked past his floor, kept going, and let the habit of survival take over. Preplanned routes weren't for comfort, they were for this. He turned left where he always turned right, reached the roof door he'd tested months earlier, and found the latch foul with new paint. That told him everything. Someone had freshened the set. Down 2 flights, into the service corridor that smelled like bleach and rubber. He listened. A cough, not a janitor's, too controlled. He stepped into the laundry room, propped a mop against the handle, and went out the window onto the metal fire escape. Snow on the rail. Good. Noise cover of its own. He moved slow enough to be boring, fast enough to be gone. On the street, the city felt arranged. Militia at the corner, a van idling too long, a man reading a paper without moving his eyes. He slipped into a metro entrance he'd marked as an SDR pivot and bought a token with his left hand. He queued behind a woman with a loud bag and let her frustration create his shade. Through the turnstile, down the stairs, onto the platform where tile reflected everyone in ghostly slices. He didn't look for a tail, he looked for persistence. A scarf from yesterday wouldn't matter. A cadence would. He paced to the second carriage marker, pre-measured to put a support pillar between him and the camera above the clock. A man loitered by the pillar, then drifted. Good watchers drift. He mirrored the drift, stepped onto the arriving train at the last second and stood by the door, facing the window, using glass as a mirror. One face appeared twice in different cars. Persistence. He got off at the next station as doors closed, then stepped back through the same doors when they stuttered on a foot. A saved second bought him a car-length lead. He ran the loop, 3 lines, 2 transfers, 1 accidental bump that wasn't accidental at all. A hand touched his coat on a crowded escalator, not a grab, a test. He tightened his elbow, rode the stairs without turning, and let the crowd pour around him. At the mezzanine, he cut into a kiosk alley and used convex mirrors to check his 6. The face from the platform reappeared in a different hat. Trained, not militia, not sloppy. The choice arrived at a sliding door suddenly closing. He could jam it and force attention, or let it cut the world. He let the door slice, felt a hand swipe air where his shoulder had been, and watched the face flatten into glass as the train moved. He didn't smile. He took 2 stops he hadn't planned and got off into air that smelled like diesel and snow. He headed for noise. A tram yard throbbed with engines. He drifted along a fence where welders sparked and foremen yelled, then cut into a side street where a bakery vents spilled warm air. He turned his coat inside out in a doorway, reversible, bought for this, and came out a duller color with a different hem. He took off his glasses, slid them into a pocket, and changed his gait to a slight swing he'd practiced in a mirror. The city likes types. He became a type. Across the ocean, boats moved with a calm that felt earned. A Lowe's Angels class hummed along a shadow like a patient fisherman. P3 crews flew lines that matched tables too well to be fate. The library worked whether he breathed or not. That knowledge steadied him. If he was already a ghost, the work lived. He still had to choose a finish, home or burn. Home meant routine cover, a door he could close. Burn meant a safe route to a prearranged bolt hole where absence would scream. He split the difference. He walked toward a public bathhouse, paid for a towel, and took the back exit through steam that erased faces. In the alley, he paused by a drain pipe he'd once used as a signal site. Nothing there. That felt like an answer. No rescue, no net, just the next corner. He felt calm leave him in increments. He let it go. He turned onto a boulevard that fed toward his building and kept to the slow lane of foot traffic. A militia truck rolled past without slowing. A child dropped a mitten. He picked it up, handed it back, and heard the small thanks like a human note in a mechanical day. At his block, a car he didn't know sat too clean. Curtains in the stairwell window looked wrong, closed during daylight. He stepped past his entrance and circled. The smell of cigarettes under the arch matched the brand the special unit liked. He kept walking. He took himself off the board and into motion. We won't tell you if he made it upstairs or not. The story's hinge isn't the final step. It's what he'd already moved. The package had cleared. The Mosaic sat in rooms that didn't cheer. At sea, a watch officer eased a throttle and caught a creep. A sonar boy heard a flutter and held it. The network lived whether he did. What nobody on that winter street knew, the files he'd stitched together would steer metal for years. Shipyards would tweak jigs to chase ghosts he'd named. Tolerance bands would tighten because a stranger across an ocean could hear them. The ocean didn't forgive, it remembered. And because one man chose to measure instead of mythologize, it spoke a little clearer to everyone listening in the dark. The long echo, how the library rewrote the sea. Peacetime design is supposed to be clean math, tidy tolerances, neat margins. After the library, it was. Western engineers sat with Annex echoes in their heads and started tuning metal to trap habits. Propellers got edges shaved not just for cavitation delay, but to tease out the faint gear meshes that still leaked through Soviet rafts. Anechoic tiles weren't just thicker. Their patterns shifted to kill specific scatter bands the Annex table said would bounce at awkward angles. Quiet wasn't a number anymore. It was a behavior you could shape. Doctrine followed the metal. NATO ASW stopped acting like a hunt and started acting like a subscription. Signature libraries weren't binders. They were living systems with rapid update cycles. Patrol plans ran like software sprints: collect, compare, patch, redeploy. A P3 sortie briefed with yesterday's corrections. A towed array team adjusted filters between watches. The trick wasn't perfection, it was pace. If the other side changed screws on Tuesday, you wanted your rookies training to that gear mesh on Friday's simulator run. Meanwhile, something else was happening in classrooms. A retired Sonar chief, calloused hands, dry humor, stood in front of kids who'd grown up on clean digital displays and taught them the old songs. He played tapes where a 33 Hz thread barely breathed and said, "Don't stare, let it come to you." Then he killed the steady tone and made them find the pump flutter that refused to drown in weather. He told them about Annex G without ever saying the words. He taught humility with a grin. Trust the behavior, not the headline. Across the Arctic, post-Cold War Russia chased silence like a moving target. Budget-starved yards that needed metrology, pride forced upgrades that landed in patches. New screws came in, old gearboxes stayed. Rafting improved on some classes, but legacy piping runs still hummed at inconvenient harmonics. Refit cycles mixed clean metal with tired mounts, and boats left yards with different voices than they arrived with. They were quieter, sure. But the library had taught listeners to hear delta, not just volume. A smaller note, still a note. The long echo worked inward too. The fact that signature intelligence could sort not only fleets, but hulls by name forced Western shipyards to stare at their own ghosts. Tolerances tightened because nobody wanted to wear a sonic badge. Prop shops built fixtures to keep blade edges from singing after 1,000 hours. Pump vendors learned to design for graceful failure, a whine that drifted safely away from detection bands if bearings aged. Scar tissue became craft. On operations boards, meaning settled in with fewer speeches. The absence of surprise started to look like policy. A patrol that didn't bump into a ballistic missile submarine at the wrong time wasn't luck. It was the library quietly narrowing the world. Crisis timelines expanded by minutes that mattered. A captain made a measured call because his team believed the map. In rooms where miscalculation lives, belief is ballast. A micro-story carried the weight. In a hangar, that retired chief watched a young sensor operator nail a transient on a training tape the first time. He didn't clap. He nodded and said, "Good, now do it tired." The kid rolled his eyes, then hit it again after a mock 12-hour day. The chief smiled once, small and private. He'd seen the arc, from myth to method, from secrets to craft. From one desk in Moscow, pages moved through rooms that didn't cheer and ended up in hands that altered metal, manuals, and minds. The ocean didn't get kinder, it got clearer. And in the clarity, the quiet war stretched into a long echo that kept choices calm. That's how you measure a victory no one hangs a banner for, by the fights that never needed to happen. What was true? What remains unknown? Let's level with each other. You've heard a story built from real bones, but the face you followed, the man in the corridor, the mosaic, the last package, that's a composite. We did that for a reason, to protect truth where sources still blur and to capture a process that history confirms even if the names can't. What's solid? The ocean's language was decoded in part by acoustic intelligence. No myth there. SOSUS and the integrated undersea surveillance system quietly mapped exits and habits. Towed arrays and sonobuoy lines didn't guess. They correlated. Western navies built signature libraries that could sort classes, yards, and under the right conditions, specific hulls. That's documented in training memoirs and the way veterans talk about harmonics like they're old friends who never shut up. There's also the cold administrative truth. Empires generate paper. Soviet naval research programs ran systematic acceptance trials in the White Sea and Barents, instrumenting boats under load. Engineers measured blade rate, pump harmonics, turbine tones, and transient behavior at power changes. Those results circulated through ministries in annexes and technical summaries, ring-fenced by classification. But ring-fenced doesn't mean airtight. Bureaucracies leak where process meets fatigue. That pathway is real. Then there's the human side of espionage, which isn't hypothetical. The CIA's Moscow rules weren't slogans, they were survival. Tradecraft like dead drops, brush passes, signal sites under construction noise, diplomatic pouch relays. Those existed because Moscow was built to hear whispers. CIA case officers bled for that knowledge. Some died for it. You can read pieces of that world in the agency's own histories and in the lives of people like Adolf Tolkashev. the billion-dollar spy, whose aviation files rewired Western radar and missile planning. Different domain, same stakes. Industrial secrets lifted by a man in a system that couldn't see him until it was too late. On the other side, the Soviet Union didn't just sit and take hits. The quieting race was real: new screws, rafted machinery, refined gear trains, anechoic coatings, operational changes, all aimed at dragging sound under the noise floor. Some fixes worked. Some just moved the problem to a different band. Western libraries adapted in tempo, and you can trace that in how NATO ASW doctrine shifted to rapid update cycles and behavior-based identification. It's not poetry. It's practice. So what remains unknown? The single point of origin for a library like the one we described is still murky by design. Was there one mole who moved the index? Maybe there were three, each touching a different piece: procurement, trials, shipyard tolerances, without ever knowing about the others. Walk through the record and you'll see how plausible that is. The KGB's own archives, where we have glimpses, show vulnerability in the seams. Distribution lists, plant rosters, annex codes with wide circulation. You don't need one grand betrayal if 10 small ones align. There's also the question of attribution. Which unit-level identifications were luck, and which rode on lifted annexes? Crews at sea build, legend through hard nights and gut calls. Some of those calls nailed a contact because a library predicted a transient creep at load state B. Others because a sonar tech heard a wobble no one else did. Memory compresses victories. Paper doesn't. The paper is still sealed in places that don't unseal easily. We should say out loud what veterans already know. Not every classified detail here is public, and some never will be. We've stuck to verified mechanisms, documented capabilities, and plausible pathways supported by open histories of Cold War espionage and acoustic intelligence. Where we stitched scenes, we did it to reflect processes that multiple sources corroborate, without inventing magic. There's no magic in acoustics, just metal, water, and patience. And the moral fog doesn't lift with footnotes. A traitor to one state can be a guardrail against miscalculation to another. The deterrence balance depends on each side knowing enough to avoid panic and little enough to avoid arrogance. A library that puts names on shadows can steady a hand at a periscope and widen a commander's options by minutes that matter. You can call that safety. You can call it theft. Both fit. Here's one more honest piece. Oceans remember. A prop cut in 1978 still whispers a habit in 1986. A pump tolerance missed on a winter shift sings under load long after the foreman retires. The libraries built from those whispers didn't vanish with the Cold War. They updated. They're updating right now, with different bands, different boats, the same human ears behind the glass. So what was true? Acoustic signatures are real, libraries mattered, espionage fed them and people paid. What remains unknown are the stitches. Who carried which page, who burned which note, who walked home and who didn't. That's the quiet part of a quiet war. It leaves a long echo and very few names. One man's choice turned noise into knowledge and held a superpower's nerve under microscope. If you want the untold threads behind this quiet war, how a paper trail beats steel and steam, watch the next story in this series. Subscribe for more true Cold War operations and the people who bent history from the shadows.